as always on occasions like this, I really never know what to do, which is pretty much the way that I've handled my career as a musician, writer.
Well, that sure was an interesting thing to say, wasn't it? Coming from one of the most significant creative artists of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So maybe that was just a moment of self-deprecating humor, and that'd be perfectly fine. But I wonder if there was maybe some truth behind that. So today we are going to take a look at David Bowie's creative process, where he did indeed create many things from nothing. And we're going to talk about 5 particular aspects of that in today's Creativity is Everywhere. Creativity is constant. Creativity is limitless. And maybe the most surprising is that when you are in that flow, creativity is effortless. Really it is. So when I try to think of artists that I would consider to be highly creative, David Bowie would be one of those that comes right to the top of the list. Ever since his humble beginnings as a folk artist in the mid-1960s, all the way up straight through to his death, in which he was creating music full force, he never really repeated himself. He was always moving on to the next thing, leaving behind what was old, what was even successful, and always venturing on to something new, creating new sounds, working with new genres, new musicians, new looks, new personas, new images. Everything changed with him throughout his entire life, and his output was immense. I guess one of the most obvious questions that you or I might have about David is, how did he ever do that? So let's start by asking that question.
How do you make a song? How can you produce that many and this good songs? It seems to be floating out of you. Not only songs, but all kind of impressions. And how do you work?
I don't know. I've never had a problem specifically with the actual musical side. Melody and song form, structure of the musical structure of the thing has never been something that has been, it does literally seem to flow out of me. I just don't, I never stop that.
So you sit down and write?
I can be with a piano or a guitar or some instrument for maybe half an hour, and I will find that I'm writing something new, whether I want to or not. I mean, it just seems to be there. It seems to be like a tap in that way. And obviously it's just something that's really deeply within me.
So here's the number one thing we learn about David, is that his process of creativity was effortless. It was limitless. He just felt like he was attached to a tap, and then the music just flowed through him. So now that is maybe frustrating if that's not your experience, but it's also important to keep in mind that true creativity is, when it's flowing correctly, is truly effortless. However, he did follow up by qualifying that by just a little bit, so let's take a look.
Strangely enough, the irony is that it took me a very, very long time when I was young to actually learn how to write songs, how to be a songwriter. I didn't think any of the other things came naturally to me. And I really feel that I worked incredibly hard for maybe 10 years before I knew how to write songs properly. And I did some ghastly mistakes in the beginning, which for my vanities are still there, available, because I had the stupidity to record them. But I really didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't find it easy. I never found it easy when I began.
So really, he was very quick to follow that up with pointing out that he did put in a long, hard period of time of learning the craft. So yes, it's effortless, but there is that aspect of learning your craft that leads up to it. So let's not forget that. The third aspect of David Bowie's creative process I want to take a look at is his way of deleting his old preconceptions and forcing himself to move on to new things that he hadn't explored before. This was really key for him. He actually had a technique for this. He learned it from creative artists in the 1960s, but it was called a cut-up technique, and he was famous for this back in the 70s. He would cut up pieces of pre-written material, could be books, could be poems, could be diaries, could be anything, and rearrange the words and just look at them differently, forming new ideas, new sentences, maybe things that were just random or absurd, but they would stimulate for him new ideas. As technology evolved and computers got in the process, he then developed a computer program to essentially do the same thing. But the point was always the same: to move away from what had worked in the past and move on to something truly new.
It's arrived at by putting together 3 or 4 statements at variance with each other, sometimes completely unrelated statements. And from those, say, arbitrary 3 statements, one arrives at a 4th piece of information from the rearrangement of what is involved. Now, that sounds like an awful easy thing to do. Well, it is, and I think everybody should do it.
What is the biggest complaint that people have about music today? And by that I mean major label, popular music. The biggest complaint that I hear is that it all kind of sounds the same. It sounds like this song kind of copied that other song. It might be highly produced, but there's something about it that just seems uninspiring because you feel like you've heard all this before. There's a really good reason for that, because that's how the industry works. It relies on copying successful artists, seeing that as a model of how to be successful again. And so what happens is a lot of music gets repeated again and again and again and again because it's seen that that's how you'd be successful. Now, David's process was the exact opposite of that. And yes, he was highly successful. But what's interesting about that is that he would refuse to just do that thing again that got him successful back in such and such a year. He would make a clean break from that, force himself to move on to what's new. So the effect of that is that ultimately his lifetime became an epic demonstration of creative genius. The effect of the other process of repeating and repeating and repeating is artists that are here today, gone tomorrow. You never hear of them after their 15 minutes or 6 minutes or whatever it is. It's a whole different thing. If you want to be a creative artist, follow David's example. So now I want to take a look at the 4th aspect of David Bowie's creativity. And this time I want to get the perspective of a guitarist that worked with him. His name is William Burroughs, and he worked with him on several projects for several years. And he had this to say about working with David and writing music.
But that was one of the best lessons, I think, about the creative process, was not to look at the clock. And that sometimes you'd be sitting around for 3 hours reading the paper and having lunch and talking about all kinds of bullshit. And then all of a sudden someone would pick up a guitar and then, go play a chord, and one of us would go, "Hey, play that chord again. Well, now go to G diminished." And then it would start to become something. I came from the school of watching the clock, and as soon as you walk through that door, you're on the clock, you're paying the studio, so don't fuck around. Don't sit there and read the paper. But the reading of the paper was as important as the buckling down and doing it.
So what we've just learned about David's creative process is that he allowed the creativity to happen on its own timing, in its own way. He didn't force it to happen. He could have really just gone into the studio and demanded things get done in his own way and on his timing. But as you can see, that is not how he worked. It was just important to do non-musical things, non-creative things, and just get away from it for a while. And then it would eventually happen. And he knew that. He realized that. And now we've come to the 5th and final aspect of David's creativity to look at today. It's from one of his more widely circulating videos on the internet where he talks about playing to the gallery. Let's take a look.
Never play to the gallery, I think. But you never learn that until much later on, I think. But never work for other people at what you do. Always remember that the reason that you initially started working was that there was something inside yourself that you felt that if you could manifest it in some way, you would understand more about yourself and how you coexist with the rest of society. And I think it's terribly dangerous for an artist to fulfill other people's expectations. I think they generally produce their worst work when they do that.
So that fifth and possibly most counterintuitive aspect of David Bowie's creative process was that he did not play to the gallery. In fact, he advised that any other artists should also not play to the gallery. Instead, they should be following their own creative muse, is really what he was saying. This seems counterintuitive again because we believe that entertainment is all about making people happy, which yes it is, but what is going to make people happy? Is it going to be hearing the same thing again and again and repeating the same things? We've already talked about how that is not the case. What's really going to connect with people is when artists move above and beyond what they've done in the past, follow their own creative muse, and create something new. So that's our look at David Bowie's creative process. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've also been inspired by this and that maybe even been challenged to maybe make some adjustments in your creative process for the better. If you've really enjoyed this video, I'm planning on doing more. Give me suggestions on what artists to talk about. I'd love to hear them. Subscribe to the channel, ring the bell to be notified of new videos coming, and thanks for watching.